and all our participants for today's technical session 3, which is themed as Law, Society and Technology of this international conference on interdisciplinary aspects of law and technology, organized by School of Law, GD Goenka University. It is indeed an admitted fact that technology has played a massive role in changing and shaping our society, wherein it would be apt to say that it has indeed become part of our daily lives. It has paved way towards progress and innovations, which helped us make our lives easier every day. Not only our day to day lives, but drones, robots, and AV technology, they not only have ensured minimum human interaction, but have also ensured beneficial access to contagious COVID 19 patients at this time of the COVID pandemic. As far as legal profession is concerned, I would like to quote Mr. Richard Susskind, who's a pioneer in the field of law, technology, and artificial intelligence. To quote him, technology will be the main driver of this change, and in the long run, we will neither need nor want professionals to work in the way what they did in the 20th century and before. Taking this forward today in this session, we will discuss a plethora of topics ranging from regulation of content in OTT platforms, legal issues with respect to online dispute resolution, e-voting and virtual shareholders meeting, etc. And to chair this incredibly exciting session, we have with us our esteemed guest, Dr. Madhumita Kothari, who is a partner with HSA Advocates. Dr. Madhumita has almost 23 years of experience in dispute resolution, arbitration, risk consulting, international contracts, family laws, and mediation. Ma'am has worked both in-house as well as with law firms advising clients on a variety of commercial and family disputes and has built specializations across several industry sectors. Ma'am has been an arguing counsel representing clients before the Supreme Court and various high courts. Ma'am has many notable publications in Scopus and other journals in her practice domains and is a keynote speaker in various international conferences. Co-chairing this session, along with Dr. Madhumita, will be Dr. Gagandeep Kaur. Dr. Gagandeep Kaur is presently working as an assistant professor with the University of Petroleum and Energy Studies. Dr. Gagandeep has been a gold medalist in LLB, a gold medalist in LLM, and finished her PhD from Guru Nanak Dev University, Amritsar. Dr. Gagandeep's area of specialization has been cyber law, family law, criminal law, and consumer protection. Ma'am has several noteworthy national and international publications to her credit and is an orator par excellence on a wide range of legal issues. Before we commence with this session, just an advisory to all the participants. Since we have a number of participants and there is a constraint of time, all the participants are required to conclude their presentation strictly within 7 minutes. And I will be prompting the participants at 5 minutes and prompting them and advising them to conclude their presentation after the 5 minutes are over. You can type your questions in the chat box and we will take them at the end of the session. So over to the first participant of the day, Mr. K. Kirtan Shenoy, who's a research scholar from Gujarat National Law Institute. And the title of his paper is Quest for Unified Regulatory Framework for Harmonized Use of Unmanned Aircraft System.
Good morning, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, ma'am. I'll be
Please
sharing
click
my
on your
screen.
video and if you have any PPT, you can share your screen.
Yes, ma'am.
Please adhere to the time limit of 7 minutes.
Noted, ma'am. Is my PPT visible, ma'am?
Not yet.
I hope it's visible now.
Yes, it's visible.
Thank you so much. I'll be timing myself for 6 minutes. Uh, Good morning to one and all present today. I'm K. Kirtan Shenoy, research scholar from Gujarat National Law University. My topic is Quest for Unified Regulatory Framework for Harmonized Use of Unmanned Aircraft System. So I would like to begin my presentation with a short quotes from all the three learned members of this stream, and we can see that each one of them has said something or other about the unmanned aircraft system or drones as we know. So we see in these quotes that drones are an important part of our ecosystem and society, and there is a consistent growth in the aviation ecosystem with reference to the unmanned aircraft system. But as put forth by US Senator Rand Paul a few years back, that with the growth of ecosystem, there are also a lot of regulatory hurdles which each of the legislative framework in their respective countries are facing. So with that, let us see what the Drone Rules 2021 has talked about unmanned aircraft system. So it particularly says that it means an aircraft that can operate autonomously or can be operated by a remotely without a pilot on board. So it can be called as a self-autonomous flying vehicle if it is flying with autonomous feature, or it is being controlled by a person from a command and control system. Now, why it is important to discuss unmanned aircraft system? It is because of the ecosystem development in past 10 years. Just like the global positioning system, unmanned aircraft system was initially only done for ISR, that is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, as far as the military is concerned. Thereafter, as we know, we in the international humanitarian law context, we came to know about killer drones or weaponized platform. But with the application of research and development technology, we are seeing the civil and commercial applications, be it agriculture, be it disaster management, be it recreational use, or be it media or law enforcement. So there is widespread use by each of the government department or the service provider and the people. So we are seeing a complete development of ecosystem of unmanned aircraft system in Europe, US, and in India too. So, since this is a conference about technology and law, we have to see what are those few unique aspects as far as unmanned aircraft system is concerned. So, just like any other aviation platform, do we take like we take as Boeing or do we take as helicopter? There were certain hurdles in operating that. First was extensive training requirement, extensive launch preparation requirement, the weight flexibility. All these things created some or other hurdles, bringing them into the civil and commercial domain. When I showed the ecosystem. Now, how is drone or how is UAS very unique? It is because of the weight flexibility, the autonomous feature, the payload configuration, the access, even any age group. That is, it's become very easy as using as a mobile phone. So it is seeing penetration at all levels, at all age groups, at all people. So it becomes very important to understand how it will affect the individuals, both who are using it and who come under the umbrella of its influence. So, like any other technology, US is also facing the friction of what we say as which we see in law and technology. Recently, we have data protection bill and we have cryptocurrency up for discussion. We see that the development and the evolution of technology is at a much faster rate, and the regulatory framework and the legislative and policy framework is bit behind, or that is the nature of the technology. If you see the wheel of technology, it evolves at a faster rate, and the policymakers, the stakeholders, and regulatory bodies have to be on their toes to understand the implications and create the sufficient ecosystem or a frictionless network. So what are some of the pain points which we are seeing? The first thing is privacy. I would only I'll give an example of, I'll take for aspect of persistent surveillance. So how is US very unique? So it can be launched from anywhere. So it has the flexibility of vertical and horizontal launch system, and it can be mobile airborne. So if we take the example, recent example of French. So French Privacy Authority, CNIL, recently banned...
Mr. Shenoy, please conclude with your key findings.
Yes, ma'am. I'm moving towards the key findings. So what do we see? We see that there is a lot of friction with reference to privacy. That the second is data protection and the regulatory structure. So if we see this bubble, we see the development of regulatory structure and we see that there is an overlap. So when we see the overlap, we see the JARUS, the EASA, the ICAV regulation, and the drone rules regulation is the inner framework. So there are overlaps, but there are friction and pain points which we are seeing throughout the network. So what is happening is that there is a regulatory gap. So in today, if somebody is disturbed with a service provider providing drone services adjacent to any property, he cannot approach a particular authority. Similarly, if any of the company which has given a contract for any kind of service provider, if there is a data breach, they don't have a particular entity where they can go. Similarly, if there is a trespass by a particular drone, you don't know whom to approach. So the regulatory bubbles being created by the fast approaching ecosystem is of a concern. Is India working towards it? Yes. Is Europe and US working towards it? Yes. But there is a unified approach requirement which ICAO had taken successfully up with reference to the manned aircraft, with reference to Chicago Convention, with reference to all other conventions which talked about safety, regional aviation, security, and the air sovereignty. So all these principles again have to be brought forth for successful and for the success of the unmanned aircraft system. So I would be concluding my presentation as 11 seconds are left, and I would thank the chair and co-chair and GT Goenka for giving me this opportunity. Thank you so much.
The next presenter is Ms. Nidhi Sinha. Ms. Nidhi is Senior Assistant Professor, School of Law, North Cap University. Her topic of presentation is the rising trend of using abusive language in popular web series culture, a critical analysis of the Indian legal scenario. Over to you, Ms. Nidhi.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Ms. Nidhi, just to remind you, you have 7 minutes.
Sure. Is my PPT visible?
Not yet.
No, still not.
Just a second before you commence, Ms. Nidhi. Dr. Madhumita?
I'm just evaluating. Give me 2 minutes.
Yes, ma'am. When you give a heads up, then I can ask Nidhi to
Just 2
proceed.
minutes.
Yes, ma'am. Nidhi, in the meantime, you can...
So I have few questions from the first presenter. Are we supposed to ask now, or we can ask?
Yes, ma'am. There's a small request. We're advising all the participants in the chair to just jot down the questions or write them in the chat box, and we can take it up at the end of the session.
Sure.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you.
Is it visible now? Sorry.
Yes, it's visible, Nidhi. When we get a heads up from Dr. Madhumita, you may commence.
Sure.
Yes, please proceed.
All right. A very good morning to the esteemed panelists, fellow presenters, and member participants. I'm Nidhi Sinha, and I'll be presenting my views today on the rising trend of using abusive language in popular web series culture, and I've done a critical analysis of the Indian legal scenario. With your permission, I'll begin. Entertainment is a very important element of any society, and films and TV serials form a very crucial part of it. But with technology coming into picture, we had online platforms which brought a newer method of watching televisions in the form of web series, which were more convenient for the audience because they offered the audience the choice to view serials and they could decide how, when, and where to view it. Especially with the COVID pandemic hitting the world, we saw an unprecedented growth of these web series with a 28.6% CJAR. So that was the boom that web series saw. But what really went wrong was that web series were not regulated in the same manner as theatrical films, because when films are released in theaters, they are subjected to prior censorship and certification, which doesn't happen with online content. Which is why we saw that content creators of these web series were offering unrestricted content without actually looking into the extent of the abusive and foul language, factors like nudity and violence. They didn't look at the extent to which they were showing and the impact that these series like these were having on unsuitable and sensitive audience like children. It was because, unlike films, which are governed by the Cinematograph Act 1952, which allows for prior censorship and certification, and even for television serials, which is subjected to a post-regulatory approach, OTT platforms, and for purpose of my research, web series were only dedicatedly looked into in 2021 with the help through the IT rules that came in 2021. Now, the question is, why are we really talking about it? Because these rules were not really working. We had a number of lawsuits filed against content creators of certain web series, wherein even the court found that the content was objectionable and they ordered the content to be removed. A recent study found that 60% viewers of online web series found that the content was objectionable in one or the other way, and it was not suitable for children. The reason is, we need to identify why are we seeing this influx of objectionable content. The concept that is the answer here is attention span. Any audience, when they are watching anything on the TV or in a film, for a maximum of 8 seconds, they can keep their attention to it. After 8 seconds, they are bound to be distracted. And which is why content creators influx, they fuse this web series and content with factors like objectionable content in sense of foul language, violence, nudity, just to keep the audience glued to the content they're offering. What the content creators forget in this process is the impact that these objectionable content, foul and abusive language, for the purpose of my research here, is having on audience, especially young children. Now, when we talk about impact, let's understand how it works. Any factor, be it foul or abusive language, or be it any other factor like nudity or violence, they don't impact the audience of various age categories in the same manner. For example, if I show any web series which has a lot of abusive language to a set of audience, if it's a child who is below 12 years of age, because children, they are in an age wherein they believe that whatever is being shown to them, it's acceptable because their reasoning is very rule-based. There is a huge chance that they will follow what is being shown to them, and they'll also start using abusive language. As opposed to that, if it's a young teen who's between 12 to 15 years of age, there is less chances than children, but still, he will still have a chance that he'll think that this is the correct way to show aggression, to deal with frustration, because at that stage, their reasoning is developed on the basis of societal norms. So if they see use of foul language in web series, they'll think that this is the correct societal norm. They may start using it. On the contrary, when we show it to adults and teens who are between the age gap of 15 to 17 years, at that stage, adults and teens, they have the need to understand what independence means, what responsibility means. They also developed the understanding to differentiate between fiction and reality. So they may not be as negatively influenced as young teens or children, because they will use that abusive language, they'll follow it only if they're also surrounded by abusive behavior, in terms of their family or in terms of their surroundings. Adults, because they have already developed that maturity, there's a huge chance that they'll not be negatively influenced, unless, of course, they're already abusive in nature, or, they don't really have the kind of communication skills to deal with the frustration or the stress in their daily lives. Since the impact is very different, we also need to understand that any law that is addressing that issue needs to address it according to the impact factor, which is not really happening under the present scenario. Because if we look at the IT rules, they do ask the content creators to exercise self-restraint. They do ask them to categorize the content into various categories of age-based certification, for example, what we see in movies. So they're also asking content creators to classify content into 7+, 12+, 16+. And they're also telling content creators that
Nidhi,
this.
please conclude with your key findings. Sorry for
Sure.
interrupting you.
But they're also asking to give them content descriptors. But what they're not really doing and what they should be doing is that they should tell how this content has to be classified. Unless this is happening, and what presently the scenario is that content creators are applying their own standards. And that is leading to non-uniformity, ambiguity, and unreliability of these certifications that are awarded to them. Therefore, after studying a lot of international and national reports on the impact of the abusive language on various categories of audience and the limits to which content can be restricted, I have suggested these various parameters that can be introduced in the 2021 rules as far as abusive and foul language in web series is concerned. I also propose that similar set of parameters should be introduced for each theme that can be shown in a web series. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Nidhi Sinha.
Yeah, thank you.
The next presenter is Mr. Nasrullah, who's a PhD candidate from Chandigarh University.
Yes, I'm okay for Nasirullah to carry on.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Mr. Nasrullah, are you there? Mr. Nasrullah, I believe he's got disconnected. No worries. We'll move on to our next candidate, who is Mr. Purvish Jitendra Malkan. Mr. Purvish is an advocate on record, Supreme Court of India, and he's also a PhD scholar of the School of Law, GD Goenka University. The topic of his presentation is interpretation of the term information under Right to Information Act 2005 and Information Technology Act 2000. Mr. Purvish, just to remind you, you have 7 minutes for your presentation.
Very well. I will try my best to complete the presentation within the given time, madam. Is my
Dr.
screen visible?
Madhumita, with your
Yes,
consent,
yes,
ma'am, can we
please.
proceed?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Is my screen visible, madam?
Yes, it's visible.
I'm thinking. Just give me a minute, madam. Yes. So, good morning, panelists and the fellow researchers. I'm Purvish Malkan. I'm practicing in the Supreme Court, and I'm also a researcher with the GD Goenka University. My research topic for the PhD is Right to Information Act, and to find out as to whether the private institution could be amenable under the RTI or not. Present topic is dealing with the term information, which is being used in two acts, which is related to Right to Information Act and Information Technology Act. I am trying to find whether this term information does have any similarity, and if at all, to what extent under this both act. Moving to the topic of the day, the Right to Information Act is to provide for a right to every citizen to secure access to information under the control of public authorities. Whereas Information Technology Act aims to provide a legal infrastructure for e-commerce in India. It gives legal recognition to transactions involving electronic exchange of data and other forms of electronic communication. If we compare the definitions as provided under the RTI Act and Information Technology Act, as far as term information is concerned, we will find that the definition more or less talks about the data, but the difference in the definition is limited to, as far as RTI Act is concerned, information which RTI is talk about is the data available with the public authority. Whereas information under the IT Act, Information Technology Act, is talking about the data which is available on the public platform, on the e-platform, on the technological platform. So this is the difference. One is available at the behest of public authority, another is available at the public platform. Now, when we talk about the scope of this act, this first act majorly deals with the knowledge, with the information. The RTI Act majorly deals with the information or the knowledge that the citizen is having a right to access for the purpose of good governance of the country, whereas Information Technology Act authenticates the data available on the e-platform. These are the scope of this act. In order to authenticate the data available on e-platform, what is required is a digital signature. Now, this digital signature is being provided by the certifying authority, is being certified by the certifying authority who will authenticate the digital signature. Now, in order to have this digital signature, the certifying authority takes the biometrics of the citizen. They actually collect the biometrics of the citizens to authenticate the digital signature of the citizens. Now, this collection of a data of a digital signature or a biometrics of the citizen is a public function. The delegation of the government in order to collect this in order to certify this digital data is a public function, which generally been dealt by the government, but by delegation of powers is being handed over to the private institutions. Now, the issue is whether this collection of a digital signature by the private individual, by the private companies or private individual or private bodies is amenable as a data under the Right to Information Act or not. In order to understand that, we must see the background of these two acts. See, the RTI Act is majorly deals in the, as I said, is dealing with the, as a part of a good governance or the transparency of the governance. Now, in order to have this transparency, the central government has delegated, in order to have this transparency, it is required that the private institutions which majorly deals with the deals or functions as a public functionary is also is necessarily be amenable as a public authority under the RTI Act, but under the RTI Act. Now, if we come down to the application of RTI Act as such, as it is now prevailing to the Information Technology Act, then if we see section 2F of the RTI Act requires that defines public authority, and the public authority is one which actually is actually been appointed either by the Constitution or by the statute. Now, if this under the Information Technology Act, a authority which is known as controller of certifying authority is being appointed, CCA is being appointed, who is authorized to collect information or the data from the certifying authority under the regulations provided, and to that extent the data is available with the certifying authority.
Mr. Purvish, sorry for interrupting you. Please conclude with your key findings.
Very well. In a minute, I'll be able to do that. So there is a data under the regulations which is available with the CCA under section 18N of the IT Act, which is accessible by the citizens under RTI Act and nothing further. So the limited access of a citizen to the data which is available with the CCA is only amenable by the citizens under the RTI Act and no further. Therefore, my conclusion is that now, since the certifying authority is taking a task of a public function, and has held by Jackson, as held by in the case of Jackson's versus Edition, the US Supreme Court, wherein it is said that the function which is traditionally been performed by the government but has been delegated to the private authorities, then such authorities is also necessarily be amenable under the RTI Act. And therefore, my conclusion is that even this certifying authority be also be construed as a public authority and be necessarily be amenable under the RTI Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Purvish. Ma'am, the next caller is Ms. Ravina Nair, who's from School of Law, Christ University.
Hello.
Our topic is international trade practices and conflicts, their settlement with reference to the WTO regime.
What happens to participant number 3? Is he gone? Is he going to come back?
Ma'am, he has not joined in it as yet.
Okay. Fair enough.
Yeah, good morning to all.
Good morning, Ravina. Good morning.
Ma'am, can I present now, ma'am?
Yes, please.
Sure, ma'am.
Please share your screen, Ravina.
Yes, ma'am. Is it visible, ma'am?
Ravina, just to remind you, you have 7 minutes.
Sure, ma'am. Thank you. Yeah, ma'am. Good morning to all. Today I'm going to present in the topic International Trade Practices and Conflicts, the settlement with reference to WTO regime. So,
Ravina, your PPT, you have to zoom it. Are you logging in from phone?
No, ma'am. Is it not visible, ma'am?
Yeah, it's visible now. All right.
Yeah. Shall I
Okay,
begin?
please proceed. Yeah, please.
Yeah, to proceed, colonial governments weakened and disintegrated after the World War II, resulting in the creation of the sovereign emerging economics and the emergence of the development economics. So the World Trade Organization, WTO, was founded in January 1st, 1995 to replace the 46-year-old GATT. As a result, the WTO has been tasked with enforcing new trade regulations agreed upon the Uruguay round. The World Trade Institution, WTO, is a sole international organization that deals with international trade rules. Its major intention is to maintain trade running as smoothly, consistently, and securely as possible. As we all know, the main objective of the WTO is to promote the trade and to balance between the developing and the developed economics to have a perfect economy. So the dispute settlement system is a huge step toward from the GATT. It is a key component in ensuring the multilateral trading security and predictability by resolving trade dispute quickly, which is critical to the WTO's effective operation. The passage of the 15 years is very insufficient to evaluate the WTO inception, ma'am. So the objective of my research is to track the history of the dispute resolution system, to conduct a critical examination of the WTO dispute resolution procedures, and to assess the unique and differential treatment given to the poor and least developed countries, with an emphasis on adopting innovative strategies to strengthen the dispute settlement system, and to propose a recommendation for the dispute settlement and to reform the conflicts. So, on seeing the historical background, we can see that the GATT is a global treaty among the countries that is mainly established to promote the trade and to resolve the disputes among the countries. So, the objective of the GATT is that the agreement indicates its objective is that development of the resources of the world and the expansion of the product and the exchange of goods besides a reciprocal and mutual advantage that's the advantage to be mostly effective to the developing and the least developed countries, and not only for the developed countries. So, Article 22 and 23 of the GATT was the only provision that deals with the dispute settlement. Though Article 22 and 23 deals with the dispute settlement, it does not contain any precise procedures for disputing parties or even the contracting parties to follow in an agreement. So the remedies which provides under the GATT are the compensation and the termination of consensus, and the other remedies. Sorry, ma'am. That demonstrate that the WTO's dispute settlement falls as the GATT only provides the two types of remedies, which is not effective to settle the disputes in a most effective manner. So when we are seeing on the World Trade Organization, it came into force on 1995, and the dispute settlement body consists of all WTO members, and it is responsible for overseeing the implementation and efficiency of the WTO dispute settlement process for all the WTO agreements, as well as execution of WTO dispute settlement decisions. And the majority of WTO rulings are reached through consensus. The consensus is defined as an agreement among the members, except those who are not present and or abstained from panel. So the WTO, what's a dispute settlement system? The WTO dispute settlement system is administered by the WTO's agreement on rules and procedures for the settlement of disputes. And the dispute settlement system is usually equally to differences that emerge in the framework of the WTO. As we all know that when a dispute arises when the members or the parties of the WTO become when they arrive with some differences within the WTO framework. So as I earlier said, Article 22 and 23 of the GATT were the only provisions that were dealing with the dispute settlement. The role of dispute settlement bodies varies from and depends on the stage and process. So there is a strong desire to strengthen the dispute settlement system through various proposals for the system improvement. The request to reform the WTO dispute settlement process began in the year 1997 itself, in response to the decision made at the Marrakesh Ministerial Conference, in which members pledged to evaluate the dispute settlement system within 4 years. So the WTO dispute settlement proceeding has 4 separate stages, which can be distinguished as consultations, panels, proceedings, appellant body, and the implementation and enforcement for the recommendation of the panels and appellant body. So consultation literally means that allows the parties to tackle the problem and to find a solution without the parties approaching the court or without going to the court. So parties were able to clarify the case and the complaints through the process of consultation. It becomes feasible, as we all know, that the procedure in a court is more harder. So through the consultation procedure, the parties can able to easily tackle their problems and find a solution. So the parties can continue to consulting it in order to reach a solution. In fact, a solution that is mutually agreeable to the disputants and compatible with the covered agreements is certainly preferable. So the next stage is the process of panel stage. In this discussion, if after the consultation is not, if dispute
Ms.
is not,
Ravina, please conclude with your key findings.
yeah, sure, ma'am. To conclude, I have been found that the dispute settlement system have not been in a proper manner. So through my research, I have found certain points for the dispute settlement system to be more effective, and that the members should take on systematic responsibility for displaying moderation when it comes to the bringing politically contentious situations to a decision. And dispute resolution body should stick to the current approach, which is based on the judicial restraint and the avoidance of sweeping declarations, and selective multilateral political components could be incorporated in the dispute resolution mechanism without affecting the dispute settlement basic design. And members could engage in more effective research in alternative decision making methods. And members should satisfy with the procedures of the dispute settlement body. So in the past, so if we see that the WTO has WTO has emerged in the dispute settlement system, and currently in this situation, we can see that WTO is resolving the disputes in a most effective manner. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ravina.
Just
you,
one
for your
word.
enlightening
It's
presentation.
not. I'm not doing any evaluation, but I thought the topic was law, society, and technology, and I could not find anything in Ravina's paper that spoke of technology. So I wanted to make this comment to you, Ravina. I don't know if the organizers will give you an opportunity to come back, but unfortunately, contextually, your paper was
Ma'am,
not relevant.
ma'am, in the memo, I have seen certain topics, ma'am. So with regard to the WTO, I have selected this topic, ma'am.
No, but WTO, the broader framework is law, society, and technology. You should have related the WTO dispute resolution system with the application of technology. I could not understand any application of technology in your presentation. So I thought, since you are a student, a PhD scholar, this must be brought to your
No, ma'am,
knowledge.
just LLM scholar, ma'am.
Whatever, LLM, PhD, this should have been brought to your knowledge. I mean,
Dr.
anyway.
Madhumita, we have a slot for giving the feedback at the end of the session.
No, I do agree, but I will forget. There are too many speakers and everybody has individual observations, but this was something very, very relevant. So I thought I will tell Ravina on the spot.
Sure.
As
Sure,
a
ma'am.
professor,
Sure,
it's my duty to point out immediately.
Okay.
Dear, please
Okay.
proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Madhumita. Thank you, Ravina.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ma'am, the next speaker is Ms. Kirtana Singh Khurana, who is an assistant professor and assistant dean, Jindal Global Law School. Her topic is e-voting and virtual shareholder meetings in India, enhancing shareholders' participation through technology. Ma'am, with your permission, when you permit
Yes,
us,
please,
she'll
please,
answer.
please proceed.
Please proceed, Ms. Kirtana. Please share your screen.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Let me just share my screen.
Ms. Kirtana, you have 7 minutes.
Yes. Ma'am, is my window visible to everyone?
Yes, it's visible. Please switch on the slideshow.
Yes, yes, perfect. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Kirtana Singh Khurana, and today I will be presenting my paper titled E-Voting and Virtual Shareholder Meetings in India, Enhancing Participation Through Technology. Now, the path of corporate governance in its quest for transparency and probity is almost always rocky. In this regard, shareholder passivity remains one of the major impediments to successful corporate governance around the globe. Managements across the board have struggled to garner strong shareholder participation in corporate affairs. If we take the example of India, where concentrated shareholding is the norm, the majority shareholders dominate the company affairs and are able to pass resolutions that nurture their own private interests. As a result, retail investors and institutional investors who probably hold a minority stake in the companies are unable to voice their concerns suitably in light of the majority shareholders' dominance. Now, it is precisely to address such difficult situations that corporate law infrastructure across nations is witnessing the introduction of measures for increased shareholder participation. Now, in the last couple of years, of course, this debate remains very, very important in the sphere of corporate governance, how to increase shareholder participation. There have been, various, ways to address these issues. And perhaps the two most important issues wherein technology was involved was one, the introduction of e-voting, and secondly, virtual annual general meetings. And that is what I'm going to focus on today, right? So technology has played a significant role in increasing shareholder participation across the globe. Now, I have focused in my paper these two very key, contributions made in this regard, and likely, like I said, one being e-voting and the other being virtual annual general meetings. Now, through my research, I found out how incredibly successful these two legal initiatives have been in garnering greater shareholder participation in corporate affairs. Now, one issue that I started off with my discussion of the paper was shareholder passivity. Now, traditionally, a majority of small shareholders stayed out of the general body meetings owing to a lot of reasons, such as cost and effort involved in attending the meetings, or feeling that their votes will not matter at all. So why go and attend the meeting and probably waste their precious time? Now, say I'm a shareholder residing in Delhi and I buy the shares of ITC Limited, presuming that I might make some profit out of my investment. Now, ITC Limited is, of course, situated out of West Bengal. So its general meetings tend to happen in the city of Kolkata. Now, I would not especially book a flight to go there, spend my money on booking a hotel and attending the general meeting. And this is something that all of us can actually, confess, having been in a similar situation every now and then. How often do we go and physically attend general meetings? And this is a major issue globally. Now, in order to counter shareholder passivity, the concept of postal ballot was introduced sometime in the year 2001. And we then saw the advent of e-voting, which again enhanced shareholder participation to a great extent. Shareholders were no longer required to attend physical meetings, and they could participate, at the comfort of their own homes and participate in the deliberations that were actually taking place in the general meetings. Now, talking about general meetings, in the year 2020, when all of us were struggling to cope up with the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, virtual AGMs became a possibility, because it was, of course, because of the lockdowns everywhere, it was not possible to convene general meetings in a physical format in the head offices, in the registered offices of companies. So virtual meetings, as an exception, was something which was introduced by the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in the year 2020. Now, well, it was introduced keeping in mind the prevailing situation in 2020, but it actually led to excellent results. And that is what I have tried to focus, I've tried to analyze through my paper. Now, talking about the legal position of e-voting and virtual AGMs in India, I would like to start with e-voting. Now, e-voting is covered under Section 108 of the Companies Act 2013, which is to be read in conjunction with Rule 20 of the Companies Management and Administration Rules 2014. Now, as per Section 108 of the Companies Act, every company which has listed its equity shares on a recognized stock exchange, and every company having not less than 1,000 members shall provide to its members the e-voting facility. So if there are some people who might not be able to make it to the main general meeting, they can sit at home, still participate in the corporate decision making, and that is one very key advantage of having e-voting as an option. Secondly, when we talk about AGMs, we don't have a section pertaining to virtual AGMs, but generally section 96 talks about the annual general meeting, section 97 to 100 talk about extraordinary general meeting, and the other compliances you have to keep in mind when convening a general meeting. But the recent Ministry of Corporate Affairs circulars, one dated 27 June 2020, the other dated somewhat 8th December 2020, one which is the most recent one. These are a couple of circulars which allowed companies to conduct virtual AGMs and to have their shareholders participate at the comfort of their homes. Now I'll talk about the Indian companies' experience with technology. How well have these two very good initiatives by our lawmakers and the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, how well have they fared in the Indian context? Now, to talk about a couple of examples, I'm sure a lot of us would have been the investors in one of these three companies, namely TCS, Infosys, and Reliance. These three are undoubtedly the most successful companies that we have in India. Now, to talk about TCS, their shareholders meeting was held in June 2020, which saw about 1,283 people log in digitally. And, it was, of course, reported that it led to this virtual AGM led to a 3-time increase in the number of shareholders actually attending the general meeting. Then talking about Infosys, which is another leading IT firm, it held its virtual AGM on 27th of June 2020, the first AGM. And
Ms.
it also
Keetana, please
saw...
conclude with your findings.
All right, I'll just do that. Now, talking about a couple of advantages that e-voting and virtual general meetings offer: definitely accessibility, greater shareholder engagement. It leads to a lot of savings as far as time and money is concerned, both for shareholders as well as companies. It leads to better audit trail, and like I said, greater participation may lead to greater activism among the shareholders, which of course is a better thing both for shareholders as well as for companies. Now, to conclude, to give some recommendations. Now, although both these initiatives have been quite fruitful as far as India is concerned, and we've seen an improvement in shareholder participation, but there still could be certain improvements. A couple of points that I would like to highlight before I conclude. I think virtual...
conclude, Ms. Keetana. You're
Yes.
above your time limit.
Yeah. So in my slide, you all can see the recommendations that I've given. I'll just take 30 seconds. So of course, hybrid meetings, virtual shareholder meetings is the way ahead. It should not be something which is just like an exemption. It should be made a permanent thing. It's the ideal way ahead. And of course, our companies should accommodate and try to inculcate in themselves the technological infrastructure. And I believe that's the way to go. And all recommendations I've included in my slide, but because of paucity of time, I will not be able to cover it. But thank you so much, everyone. I hope if you have any feedback for me, if you have any questions, I would like to take them up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Keetana. The questions to the presenters can be typed in the chat box, and we will take them at the end of this session.
All right.
Ma'am, the next presenter is Dr. Sthiti Dasgupta, who is an assistant professor with ICFI Law School. Her topic is analysis of objectification of women in electronic media with special focus on OTT platform. Ma'am, once you permit, she'll...
Yes, please.
All right. Dr. Sthiti, please switch on the slideshow. You have 7 minutes.
Is it visible?
Yes, it's visible. Please switch on the slideshow.
Yeah, I have done it.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, a very good morning to all of you. I'm presenting on analysis of objectification of women in electronic media with a special focus on OTT platform. Through these images, we can just get a simple idea how objectification is a problem, which I'll be discussing later on in the coming up presentation. So the first and foremost thing that I want to talk here is that something about that women should be viewed as something more than just bodies, see more and be more. And with this concept, I would like to delve into the presentation. That is, when we are talking about the technological advancement in this 21st century, media is one of the most prime development, and you can say that it has given a new facet to the technological and communication advancement all around the world. And as we are saying that technology and media are intertwined, entertainment industry doesn't get away from here, because entertainment industry is a very big boom, something which has got its presence felt all over the world due to the development which has happened in media world. Now we have to understand the concept that media plays a very decisive role in socialization process. The way we behave, the way we talk, whatever we take, whatever we consume, everything gets a kind of boom or gets a kind of push by the way media shows something. So it plays a very decisive role here. Similarly, media plays also a very important role in eradicating gender inequality, as I have told in the very beginning itself, because I'm concerned here with the objectification of women. So I would like to focus on the way media plays a pivotal role in eradicating or in prolonging the sustenance of gender inequality through the concept of objectification. So as I told, that women plays a very special role in the development of human species. We all know that what kind of a role women are playing in the development of the whole world. She is the half of the population of the whole world, but somewhere down the line, she is still considered as only the progenitor. She is considered to be the weak one. She is considered to be the vulnerable section of the society. And this deplorable situation of women has been under constant scrutiny. May that be feminism as a movement which has tried all around to recognize womankind as not the other, and her consent rights were very much a concern for the feminists all over the world. And in all this development which has happened in feminism, in all these waves which has development, we all know that second wave, first wave, second wave, third wave, we are also talking about the fourth wave, and various schools of feminism which talks about the rights of women, emancipation
Dr.
of women.
Sthiti, are you moving your slides?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Please go ahead.
Is it visible?
Yeah, we can only see the first page. Or am I the only one?
I'm moving it.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay, so as I told you, the feminism as a movement has recognized these rights. So amongst the many layers of issues which actually affect the rights of women, a very prominent debate surrounds around the use of women as an object, or better termed as objectification of women. Whenever a woman is actually seen as an object other than her entity as an individual, are just merely taken as a part of society having certain body parts, or her entity as such is used as an instrument to develop something, to socialize the whole society in a certain way. In that process we call it objectification, and whenever it is done with the idea of sexualization, we use the word or the prefix sexual objectification. Now, sexual objectification or objectification as such had made thinkers like Immanuel Kant, MacKinnon, Dworkin, Martha Nussbaum, Nancy Boyer, and many other thinkers to work upon it. But the deplorable part is that all of this concerned debate surrounding objectification of women, and specifically may that being print media or electronic media, has been part of only academic discourse or part of the right or some kind of bloggers thinking, but it has not become a part, or you can say that it didn't concern the specific lawmakers. So the approach has to be influenced. The way legal policy makers are making the laws, how they're looking into this gender emancipation through the use of media, in that particular aspect, this objectification has to be inserted. Although, as I said, it has been recognized both in Eastern and Western societies, but it has hardly specifically answered. In the Indian context, actually, we can see that how sexuality has always been debatable. If we see in India, India is not limited to the metro cities, but in the electronic media and specifically the OTT platform, if we see, everywhere the women are somewhere down the line used as objects to promote sale of certain products or sale of any media production. May that be any show, may that be any movie, may that be any item song, may that be any advertisement product that has been any product that is being advertised. So everywhere, women were being projected as an
Slides.
object.
If you please move the slides.
I'm
Doctor.
absolutely moving the slides.
Okay,
Actually.
okay, it's okay. Maybe there is some connectivity
Yeah,
issue.
yeah,
So no
yeah, yeah.
problem. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So the time has come to actually look into this issue of objectification in media, and we have to resolve this issue and how it can be done. And specifically, when we are talking about OTT platform, it is something, or over-the-top platform is something which is developing like anything. And specifically in this COVID pandemic time, when people were having internet in their hands with cheap packages, they were using internet like anything. While in electronic media, which is being regulated here in India, when we are talking about India, it is being regulated on the grounds of
Dr.
indecency
Stuti,
of-
sorry for interrupting you, but please
Yes.
conclude with your key findings.
Yes, I'm concluding. It is actually being regulated on the grounds of obscenity, indecency, and vulgarity, but objectification doesn't find any place. Similarly, in the case of which is a part of electronic media itself, it is the new norm in the world, but it doesn't get the regulation it's supposed to get, or it is actually being self-regulated. Recently, in 2021 itself, we got this information technology guidelines in digital media code, but it is also not answering this concept of objectification of women in electronic media. And in Padmana Shankar's case also, the fourth that OTT platform is not broadcast. The question comes how it will be regulated and how objectification will find a place in that particular concept of regulating this OTT platform. And definitely my suggestion is that the regulations or the ethics code which has been presently made, because the implementation, how much it will be successful is still a question, but in that ethics code itself, objectification has to be inserted, and it has to be seen that women are not being used as an object just to sell any particular media product. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stuti, for your presentation. Ma'am, the next presenter is Mr. Parth Sharma, who is Assistant Professor, Christ Academy Institute of Law, Bangalore. Ma'am, the topic is Secondary Characters in Biopics, a Privacy Conundrum. Ma'am, with your permission.
Please carry on. Please carry on.
All right, Mr. Parth, please proceed. You have 7 minutes.
I hope the screen is visible, ma'am.
Yes, it's visible. Please switch on the slideshow.
Good morning, everyone. So my topic is secondary characters in biopics, a privacy conundrum. Right. So privacy, again, it is a very
Mr.
difficult
Parth, can you
question.
please switch on the slideshow?
I've done that.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So the topic is secondary characters in biopics, a privacy conundrum. As we all know that privacy, again, it is a very difficult aspect to explain in a single line or maybe in 2 or 3 words. To start with, again, the privacy differ from person to person. To give a simple example, when we use our smartphone, many of us, we used passcode, many of us has pattern lock, many of us used the lock for the whole mobile, and many of us, we used the lock only for the gallery and the social media pages. And when there is no specific legal framework in terms of privacy, again, it is very difficult to ascertain as to what privacy denotes. And we have to resort to the judgments of the Supreme Court in this regard. So to start with, especially in the recent times, there's a rapid development of technology, right? So in the last 5 years, there's an advent of OTT platform, different YouTube channels where the new kind of cinema has come in or pitch in. So when we talk about the digital revolution, earlier we had only Doordarshan, right? A few years back when the movies will be telecasted there. Then after that, there were various, especially the channels which has pitched in. And now in the last 1 decade, or especially in the last 5-6 years, there's the advent of OTT platform. So especially in terms of cinema, we have a censor board under the Cinematograph Act 1952. But especially when we talk about the OTT, it is mainly unregulated. Though we have certain laws which are applicable to them, but where we don't have a specific legal framework in this regard. And the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Ministry of Department of Electronics, they have issued certain guidelines, but to a certain extent, they are found to be inadequate to deal with the problems. Now, the problem is in terms of biopic. What is biopic? It is a dramatize the life of a fictional person in a, especially in a non-fictional movie, right? So it is based on a non-fictional person and which has certain aspects of fiction attached to it. Now the problems comes especially the controversies in the biopics. The recently, to take few example, Gunjan Saxena, Delhi Crimes, MS Dhoni, and Accidental Prime Minister, where we have to, sometimes we fail to focus on the secondary characters which are playing an important role in that particular movie. And being the part of the audience, we create our own perception, especially on the part of secondary characters. Take for the example of many of the movies, especially related to the sports, when because of the fiction, they show a sports authority or a minister in a bad limelight. And the public generally create a perception about a particular person and they only change the name. So the focus is in relation to the privacy. Now, when we talk about the invasion of privacy in digital era, what is the concept of privacy? So if we take the judicial trend, right, starting from 1954 MP Sharma case, 1962 Kharak Singh case, 1975 Govind versus State of MP, 1994 Raj Gopal case, and finally in 24th August 2017, in Justice Retired K.S. Swamy case, it has been held that right to privacy is a fundamental right under Article 21. But like other fundamental right, the privacy is also not absolute in nature. It is subject to the procedure which is established by law. And when we don't have an adequate or a specific legal framework with regard to privacy, again, it is very difficult to ascertain as to what constitutes privacy and what are the, to what extent it can be expended. Now the problem comes, especially when there's a conflict between artistic freedom and right to privacy, right? So the producer, the writer, the director, they have certain artistic freedom. But in the light of exercising Article 19, that is freedom of speech and expression, which is guaranteed under Constitution of India, in case now, since we have privacy as a fundamental right under Article 21, where to strike a balance? How to decide the doctrine of harmonious construction, that where the balance can be made out when there's a conflict between artistic freedom and right to privacy. So that is very pertinent question which has come up. And when we talk about Article 19 Clause 2, which talks about the reasonable restriction, there is nothing which is mentioned about privacy. It only talks about sovereignty, integrity, security of the state, public order, decency, morality in relation to contempt of court, defamation or incitement to an offense. And there are many movies, especially on the OTT, which are misleading, especially in terms of the secondary characters of the biopics, which we often ignore or which we don't sometimes focus. And there are certain movies where the secondary characters in biopics, it has relevance and importance. Take for the example, the new movie which has come in like 83, right? Maybe the wife of a cricketer, maybe a press reporter, sports minister, there may be some particular person which we are not aware of, which we get a hint or a clue while watching the movie, and we create a perception about that particular person. So again, it is a serious trend which is taking place, and sometimes that fictional aspect is turning into defamation. Right, ma'am,
Mr. Path, sorry for interrupting you, but please conclude with your key findings.
Yeah. So when we talk about the regulation of content in cinema in India, we have the censor board for the movies, and in terms of OTT platform, we have intermediary guidelines. There's a consultation paper by the TRAI in 2015. Unfortunately, that has not been implemented yet. So the recommendation or the conclusion is opportunity. right? So especially the major secondary characters in a biopics, they should be given an opportunity to explain their case, what has happened. And especially someone who is not alive, there has to be consent which can be taken by their legal heirs to a certain extent, not the absolute authority can be given to them. Then when we talk about the identity, right? So many of the times a particular person can be identifiable while watching the movie, especially the secondary characters. So it is very important to make sure that their dignity can be protected, because sometimes while creating a public perception, they may lose their job or the future opportunities because of a particular role in which they have shown in a bad limelight in a movie. Ultimately, disclaimer will not be enough. There has to be certain clause which has to be provided in the contract, and ultimately there has to be specific guidelines which has to be brought for the OTT as well and the censor board as well, because generally they talk about the nudity and the grant of certificate, but in terms of privacy they often ignore. So if a movie has been made on a historical perspective, maybe a panel of historians or experts can be taken into account, and depending on that, it can be modified or amended. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Parth. Ma'am, the next presenter is Karisma Mariam, who is an LLM student from School of Law, Christ University, Bangalore. Her topic of presentation is Challenges of E-commerce in the Indian Scenario. Ma'am, with your permission.
Yes, dear, please proceed.
Please
Good
proceed,
morning.
Karisma.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're
Yes.
audible, Karisma, and you have 7 minutes for your presentation.
Sure, ma'am. Ma'am, is my screen visible?
Not yet. Yeah, it's visible. Please switch on the slideshow.
Yes, ma'am, sure. So good morning, everybody. Good morning, esteemed panelists and fellow presenters. So with your permission, shall I start my presentation?
Yes, please proceed.
My topic for today is challenges of e-commerce in India, with special reference to the contracts in India. So first of all, let's talk about the definition of e-commerce. So the term e-commerce refers to a business model that allows the companies and individuals to buy and sell products and services over the internet. So, and also when we talk about challenges that's happening with respect to the e-commerce in India, the first or the major challenge faced by e-commerce in India is that the internet penetration in India is very low when we compare it with the major Western countries of the world. So what we find is that another problem is that the low grade penetrations and
Karisma, sorry for interrupting, but your slides are not moving.
Yes, I'll just start moving the slides. So before I say the introduction. Hello?
Yes, please.
Yes. And the last one is the privacy, the issue of privacy. And in Puttaswamy case, it was held that the right to privacy is a fundamental right. So if you move to the respect to the contract, online contracts, online contract is a document that has been created and signed entirely digitally without the use of paper or any hard copies. So Section 2 Clause H of Indian Contract Act defines a contract as an agreement that is enforceable by law. So electronic transactions are legally binding and are contractual, and these are essentially very similar to the offline contracts, but only difference is the difference in the transaction at the medium of the transaction. But the Indian Contract Act recognizes the electronic contract because nothing in the Contract Act prohibits the enforceability of electronic agreement if such agreement is in conformity with the essentials of contract as stated in the Indian Contract Act. So what are the essential elements of contract? First one is there must be two parties, and if you are talking about electronic contracts, then the medium must be electronic, and there must be proposal, and there must be an acceptance. Then there must be a valid consideration, and there must be intention to create legal relations between the parties. There must be free consent, which is one of the most important element. And next one is the competency of parties. That is, both the parties must be major. So let's move on to the legislative landscape of online contracts in Indian perspective. The first one is Indian Contract Act. The Indian Contract Act 1872 consists of all rules which are applicable to contracts, as I have earlier stated. The essentials which are needed to form a contract should be covered under this law. A contract which is paperless and in electronic form, and that covers all the specifications as per the Contract Act of 1872 is considered valid under Indian law. The next one is the Information Technology Act of 2000. And this act develops a legal infrastructure in the cyberspace. The act acknowledges email as a valid and legal form of communication that can be produced and used in court. For this same, the Indian Evidence Act has been appropriately changed, and digital signatures are also recognized by the Indian Evidence Act. So in the Indian Evidence Act, the term document also includes computer outputs. That is, any information contained in an electronic record, which is printed on a paper, stored, recorded, or copied in an optical or magnetic medium produced by a computer. And such information shall be admissible as an evidence in a court of law without production of originals. And thus, we can say that the e-contracts are admissible as evidence in the Indian courts as per the Indian Evidence Act. Next, let's move on to the issues and challenges faced in e-contracts. The Indian Contract Act and Information Technology Act are essentially connected. And the first problem is that in order to first problem is the security aspects with respect to the online contract. So basically, there are three major concerns for international electronic contracting. The first one is authenticity, second one is enforceability, and the last one is confidentiality. And authenticity involves the verification of the person that is dealing electronically. And enforceability involves the legal scope of the license granted or the warranty given under a transaction. And confidentiality revolves around the protection of sensitive information such as payment information and trade secrets. Is my screen moving?
No.
Okay. The next point.
Yeah, it's moving now. Please conclude with your
much.
key findings, Charisma.
Yes, just give me a second. Yeah. Okay, last one is data protection, as I have already told you, discussed. Protecting the facts in online is the major worry of every individual. And Information Technology Act 2000 and the Section 43A of IT Act both highlights the recommendations of how to protect data in India. Every company should take care in order to protect from corruption, damage, loss, or destruction of any kind of private information or data. Also in the communication of the contract between parties. So another point is e-commerce is very dynamic, fast changing media. Many of the definition concepts in our law has become outdated. So the court should give high value and high need to bring in the experts in order to in the field of computer to bring in new changes in our law. And also the government should also conduct training classes for judicial officers and as well as other officers of the government to appreciate the forensic aspects of the computers and also the internet. So with this, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Charisma. Ma'am, the next caller, Ms. G. Vinaya, has cited her unavailability to present in this session. So with your permission, we'll move on to the last caller of our day, who is Krupa K. Verghese, who's a student of School of Law, Christ University. And the topic of presentation is Impact of Globalization on International Trade.
Good morning.
Just a minute, Priti.
Yes, ma'am.
There is some confusion. We have missed on number 11 and number 3, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, fair enough.
Yes,
3
ma'am.
and 11 have been
11, ma'am,
okay.
G. Vinaya, she has cited her unavailability just
So
now.
3 was missing, 3
Yes.
left, and
3
11
left
is missing.
and 11 is missing. Yes, ma'am.
Perfect.
Yes, ma'am.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes.
Ma'am, can you
Okay.
proceed?
Yes, please.
Okay, Krupa, please proceed. Please share your screen.
Okay, sure, ma'am.
And Krupa, you have 7 minutes like all the other presenters.
Okay. Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yes, it's visible. Please switch on the slideshow.
Okay, ma'am. Sure. Good morning, everyone. Today, my topic is impact of globalization on international trade. So if we look into the concept of globalization is actually a large phrase that incorporates many different viewpoints. In terms of wealth, culture, community, and government, it refers to the global perspective of various nations gathering together and teaming up. Globalization, it promotes an international perspective regardless of national identity, and as a result, globalization has
Krupa, can you
limited
please
the-
switch on the slideshow?
Is it?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, globalization, as the name implies, the focus is not on countries but on the whole world. It actually denotes the nations networking as businesses, economy, individuals, and thoughts become more integrated in the world market. Now, if we look into the historical evolution of globalization, we can say that it dates back to the 19th century, but its rate of expansion decreased between the outbreak of World War I and the late 20th century. In addition to the establishment of various collaborations, partnerships, acquisitions, and oligopolies, aided in this globalization-induced shift. Globalization's exact roots are still a point of controversy, while some experts believe that globalization began in the contemporary era, while others believe that it is a long-standing phenomenon. If a broad definition is given to the term globalization, it can be said that any interaction that exceeds the limits of one nation and reaches the another one has an influence on the society, and it is a component of that as well. So based on this, we could argue that the term's origin dates back thousands of years since trading was done amongst great empires. We can also say that the globalization seems to have had a massive effect on the civilizations all across the globe, especially on indigenous ones. If we consider globalization as a trade without barriers, we can say that a genuinely globalized world might imply a free market in which anyone anywhere in the globe can make a purchase on practically anything to anyone else. If you carefully consider this thing, the globalization might imply the complete abolition of borders and the free supply of funds, commerce, arts, and other commodities among nations. Some of the proponents of free trade argues that this really boosts the financial growth and access, particularly between emerging countries, and improves civil freedoms and results in increased efficiency. For developing economies, this means that reduced pricing, greater work opportunity, and better products and increased level of living. That is what globalization is to some of the developing economies. As far as India is concerned, we can say that how this globalization has impacted in India. If we consider the early 1990s under the globalization policy, India took a significant step to establish the new economic sector. This reform drove the market in a much more entrepreneurial direction. Indian manufacturers have been able to scale up their headquarters and increase their manpower with actually small cost and supply new services to a wide spectrum of people as a result of this globalization. Prosperity in the export sector has been aided by globalization, which has resulted in the expansion of India's employment market. Apart from that, in Indian corporations have begun to acquire more major foreign organizations, and something that many of us would not have imagined conceivable just a few decades ago. Indian corporations have grown at such a blistering rate that a lot of them now appear on the world's most valuable brands. If we consider the evolution of international trade system, it can be split into three phases. The first phase addresses a traditional view of international trade that existed only till the 1970s, when industrial variables were significantly less flexible. In addition, the natural resources, components, and completed goods had restricted the movement in a system that was highly controlled with constraints such as taxes and import restrictions. If you consider the second phase, the movement of inputs, notably investment, proved accessible to the 1980s. The context in which the international businesses was occurring allowed for a greater understanding of certain places' economic potential. At the same time, the regional trade agreements arose and this enhanced the international economic system from a regulatory and legal viewpoint. Employment operations were fully shifted to relatively low-cost regions due to high manufacturing costs in historic industrial zones. The phase begins on a national level and then spreads to neighboring nations as soon as practicable, and eventually has become genuinely a worldwide thing. Then the third phase, there seems to be an increase in the international trade, which now includes a wide variety of facilities that were formerly restricted to local areas, as well as an increase in the transportation of products. Now the technology has improved, and thus the trade has become more efficient. That is what it comes in third phase. And if we consider the developing countries and the global trade, then we can say that even though this globalization facilitated the advancement of several countries with the help of international trade, it has also some drawbacks as well. Some developing countries, for instance, seem to be most hit by the negative effects of globalization and modernization. The global trade is believed to encourage nations to work together, but there are several results that have revealed that this may have only served to highlight the inequalities amongst industrialized and less developed nations, widening the disparity of wealth. But if we consider it and from another point of view, certain developing countries like India and others have reaped enormous benefits from this globalization. The national governments face certain challenges in order to maintain a balance between globalization, trade, and their national legal policies. The globalization has taken away the power of countries to plan and implement their unique agendas. Nations attempting to rearrange their economies.
Ms. Krupa, please conclude.
Sure, ma'am. Sure. The nations attempting to rearrange their economies as a result of international commerce have considerably weakened their country's opportunity to carry out particular law and development initiatives. To conclude, we can say that globalization is indeed an unstoppable process that benefits a wide range of countries. Globalization has twofold impact at the organizational level. Overall, it enriches the administrators while adversely affecting the workers. While globalization may not be ideal approach for increasing international economic strength, it is critical that attempts are made to supply sufficient benefits also. So we can say that both the rich and poor countries should join together and combat the effects of globalization. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Krupa, for your presentation. Ma'am, we are done with the speakers for the day. I would now...
Video on.
I would like to request you to kindly give some pearls of wisdom in your concluding remarks for the benefit of our audience.
Thank you everybody. Thank you all the paper presenters. I have a few observations, and of course my observations are very, very objective because I want everybody's improvement. And all those who have been speaking here, I'm sure you're looking forward to a career in academics. You're looking forward to make better presentations at national and international level. And I'm sure all of the presenters would have this aspiration. And therefore, there are a few observations which I would like to make. First of all, when you're making a presentation, your body language, and if it's an e-presentation, your ambience become extremely important. Now, I observed specifically one of you had a very disturbing body language in spite of being a very, very good speaker. You are shaking and moving your hands too much. And that's not your fault. I was at an international conference where I was a keynote speaker, and one of very senior United Nations officer, I won't say he's even higher than an officer, it's a very senior level. He had a very bad habit of shaking his hands and thumbs. And I told him, I personally told him, since we are good friends, that, sir, this was very disturbing to all the viewers on an e-platform. And the same observation I would make to my dear friend who spoke on company law and e-voting very well. But unfortunately, on an e-platform, if you have the habit of shaking your fingers and hands, please do it below the camera. Because on the camera, it becomes very disturbing to the viewer, and it portrays an opinion that you are nervous. So it should be avoided. Second thing, especially with Sthiti, there were a few other speakers, but with Sthiti, you had so much of backlight behind you that your face was not visible. This was with one or two other speakers also. Whenever you are on an e-platform making an e-presentation, please ensure that light behind you is less than light in front of you. So if the light in front of you is more, your face is visible, your smile, your facial gestures are visible. If you have more of a backlight, we don't see your face, we don't see your reactions, and therefore a one-to-one interaction with the audience, how you cut across to the audience, that gets very diluted. So this is one important aspect. Whenever you are making a presentation, you have choice of backgrounds on the Google or Teams or any of these platforms. So if you don't think the ambience that you are sitting in is right for an e-presentation to give a dignified and, elevate your presentation, please select artificial background, a virtual background, and add it to your presentation. I think that adds a lot of value. And now coming to the presentations. I don't know whether the abstracts have been evaluated before the papers were presented to us, because as I rightly pointed in the middle of the presentation, that the girl presenting who's an LLM, I think she was from Christ, if I'm not wrong,
Yes.
her presentation did not actually relate to the larger umbrella of topic law, society, and technology. So she spoke on the WTO dispute resolution process, and she went into a WTO dispute resolution process, and the contents were very, very mundane and kind of looks like a copy-pasted work from the book or the internet. I didn't find any originality in the presentation. I didn't find any relation to technology per se. This is also about some more of the topics, except for, I think, the first guy who's presented on the aviation industry, and our friend who presented on the company law and e-voting, and there was one lawyer on information technology, and there were one or two other people. I found the relation was more between law and society rather than interweaving technology. And then when you interweave technology, it's not a negative criticism of the application of technology that you have to take into consideration. You also have to take the positive impact of technology and how technology can add to the development and growth. Technology is moving very, very fast. So what is happening in society today? Technological development at the pace at which it is moving, if it is going to be unregulated, that is going to jeopardize our human existence. And what will happen is an unregulated technology is like a wild horse. So if it is not controlled, if it is not regulated, we are digging our own graves. All those of you who practice in arbitration know public policy is like a wild horse. So the whole concept of public policy and unregulated technology, I would relate that without any definition, without any regulation, it becomes a very difficult proposition. And by the time we decide to regulate technology, which is taking a lot of time for various reasons, and one of the reasons definitely is the incapability of the Indian legislature to keep pace with technological development. Now that's where the academia and people like all of us come in. In England, I've seen the academia plays a very, very proactive role and works together with the legislature and the judiciary. Unfortunately, in India, we academicians do not have a high impact role in terms of policy making and decision making. There's always a lobby of the ruling government. There is always a coterie that works, and real academicians, real researchers do not even have the opportunity to participate in legislative draftings. So that creates the gap. So I would always encourage conferences like this. GD Goenka is doing a wonderful job. And whichever university is indulging in these kind of conference and paper presentations, I think these should be accumulated, and you either publish it in a book form and bring it to the knowledge of the law ministry, the law commission, so that they are able to take the inputs of the research scholars and incorporate in the legislative drafting. Only then there will be successful regulation of various aspects of development in any field in this country. So thank you very much. These were very humble inputs I thought I'll put across, and I hope nobody has felt hurt with my comments, because I'm very objective. All those who know me, they know I'm very objective, and I wish the good and development and growth of everybody. So my best wishes to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And I'm sure the participants have been greatly enriched with your very objective, and I would say, if they take it in a positive sense, a very positive feedback. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Preeti.
Ma'am, I now move on to our co-chair, Dr. Gagandeep Kaur. Ma'am, I would like to request you to kindly give some concluding observations, and I believe, ma'am, you had certain questions as well.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Preeti. First of all, I would appreciate the efforts of GD Goenka for conducting this conference on such important and relevant issues. And except one or two papers, all the papers were quite relevant. The participants have discussed unmanned aircraft, then OTT platforms, abusive language on web series, e-voting, certifying authority to be notified as a public authority under RTI. In addition to that, secondary characters in biopic, consent and identity issues. Then see, all these topics are very, very recent, and very obviously India is coming up with the exact laws on these. I have few observations. If the participants are present, they may note down, because when you would have to submit your paper for publication, these suggestions would help you to reframe your paper. So my first, it was question, but now I will modify it to a suggestion, because there is as such, I don't think that participant one is present. So my one suggestion is that the participant who presented on unmanned aircraft, number one, That participant has discussed so many challenges and drone rules also, Aircraft Act also. As we are not having papers, so I can't comment exactly, but this is my one suggestion, that you should focus on more suggestions, because I didn't find any suggestions except the challenges. Again, I would say my restriction that I don't have your paper. This is my submission, that if you have not worked on suggestions, kindly add on the suggestions. You have highlighted challenges very well, but without suggestions, your paper would not have any weightage for the readers. Right? So the second paper was on abusive language by Nidhi, to regulate the web series. That was quite interesting because that is a fact. But again, I would like to see more laws. I wanted to see more laws, analysis of those laws, overlapping of those laws. So again, I was not having paper, so I can't say that you have done it or not, but this is one suggestion. Another paper was by Advocate Povish. He has mentioned that certifying authority should be a public authority in RTI. That is quite interesting, as well as I feel some contradictions would be there, because this is really a challenging point, but I would appreciate your thinking process. You thought on that part also. But so far as my knowledge is concerned, is it clearly written somewhere that it is not in RTI?
Yes, madam. Yes, madam. Actually, the certifying authority being a private body, it cannot be amenable as an public authority under Section 2H of the Right to Information Act. The only information which can be sought is through controlling authority, and controlling authority has limited access to the disclosures which is to be statutorily be made by the certifying authority, and nothing further than that.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for the clarification. Then my another suggestion would be on the presentation by Dr. Parth. I agree with you that the depiction of biopics in secondary characters, but I just want to give you another perspective of the same topic, that don't you think so much restrictions would ultimately curb the creativity and imagination at all? Though we all are aware that the agreements are there when such biopics are made, identity is hidden, there are disclaimers also, consent also, and despite those agreements, if someone wants to get popular, that is a different thing. So kindly think on that part also, because we can't put so many restrictions on the creativity. Ultimately, so many restrictions would end the imagination. Keeping in, if we consider the privacy of a person and we are coming up with a biopic, I don't think this is something wrong, but just a point to reconsider. And yes, my strong opinion, that is a student, so I would not say much on the topic of e-commerce challenges in India. I just want to say, beta, there was no novelty in your paper. Already e-contracts are valid under Section 10A of IT Act. So many amendments have been made in evidence in Indian Contract Act. So this topic was, I think, she did not actually, I feel that she did not read it properly. But again, this is a suggestion to reframe the paper. So rest, all the presenters were very, very good. And last observation, even we do presentations. So the last slide should be for references slide. So from the references, people would come to know that how many references you have used, because we are not having papers. So last slide should be a slide for references. So thank you so much. Otherwise, this was a wonderful experience. Thank you all the presenters.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your feedback, and I'm sure all our presenters would adhere to it and improvise on their papers. All right, so the floor is open for any questions. Any questions with respect to the presentations or the legal issues which were discussed today? You can write in the chat box as well as raise your hands and ask orally. Okay, I have a small observation, and this is for for those presenters who've made presentations with respect to, content on OTT platforms. Now, all of us know, especially since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, one of the reasons which was, in a very humorous way, where the people were asked to stay at homes during the lockdown was that you have an opportunity to watch Netflix. So that much importance these OTT platforms have garnered, especially during the COVID pandemic. And if anybody of us is a regular, watches the content regularly on these platforms, we can be shocked to know the kind of content which is being streamed nowadays. Just the other day, my husband was telling me that he was watching some web series and he was shocked to see the kind of content. And he was in fact asking me, don't we have any regulations for regulating the OTT platforms? And I believe there was a case in the Supreme Court. It was, if I remember, it was Padmanabh Shankar versus Union of India, wherein also, the presenters have also said that, that the content which is streamed on OTT platforms, it's not broadcast and, it's not meant for public exhibition, but it's only meant for private viewing, and hence it cannot be, regulated under the Cinematograph Act. Recently, also, there were, information technology rules which were promulgated by the ministry, wherein, apart from the other things, they have, they have laid down guidelines for a self-regulatory code of all these OTT content platforms. Now, any of the presenter who presented, I'm actually, not clear about this. So I just want to know from the presenters that, all of us know that these OTT platforms, they are big corporate houses, right? And it's a known fact that, there are groups with respect to these OTT platforms. For example, Netflix and Amazon Prime, they are, in a separate group, and certain groups like Sony Live and Voot, they form part of a totally different group. So how, under these circumstances, we can expect all these, OTT platforms who are big corporate houses, always looking for their profits, to unite actually and create a self-regulatory code? Or does the act envisage, do the rules envisage that self-regulatory code will be, unique, as in each OTT platform will have a separate self-regulatory code? So can anybody of the participants who presented on the legal issues with respect to OTT platforms clarify this to me?
Thank you, Dr. Preeti, for the question. That was my topic. I was talking about use of abusive language on OTT platforms. Something that you've mentioned, that is something that I also mentioned, that we do have a law in place. The IT rules talk about it. Before the IT rules came into picture, these corporate houses who own these OTT platforms, they had come together to frame a self-regulatory code, but it was only a handful of these organizations which were participating in enforcing or in even accepting the self-regulatory code, which is why the code did not work, because everybody had to agree. And then the IT rules have come. Now these IT rules, I wouldn't say that they are not sufficient, but they're not completely adequate to deal with the picture. Like I mentioned in my PPT also, they are talking about that, they have laid down guidelines that you need to classify your content. You need to take into consideration the categories of audience that may see. But where they are exactly lacking, and what I pointed out was that just telling them that you have to classify content will not really do the job. You have to also, because they're not lawyers, they're just laymen who don't understand the legal terminologies that we as lawyers or law students or academicians deal with. So telling them that freedom of speech and expression can be restricted on these grounds is not really going to help. You have to look into the various themes that can be portrayed and that can be objectionable after a certain point of time. And then you have to understand the impact that each theme can have on various categories of audience, depending on their age. So I chose only the abusive language. If I had to take everything, it would probably take a dissertation to do it. But it was just a research paper. I could not stretch it beyond the boundaries of word limits, which is why I only chose abusive language and foul language. So as I mentioned, I had studied a number of national and international reports that talk about how these languages impact categories of audience, which is why I had introduced parameters. So yes, we are very fortunate that this technology has come. We're very fortunate to have this convenience. But at the same time, when we talk about freedom, we have to talk about the limitation also, because the balance between the exercise of freedom and the restriction for the benefit of the public has to be maintained. So like Madhumita ma'am very clearly and very rightly pointed out, that if the technology is not regulated, it's like a wild horse. So it's good that we have a technology, but at the same time, we have sensitive audience also. So there needs to be some restriction on what can be shown and what can be shown to which class of audience.
Ma'am, I would like to add here, it's
Yes,
not
please,
only about...
Dr. Siti, please.
Yes,
please.
yes, yes. As Nidhi ma'am has rightly said, at the beginning, few of the groups had actually brought this self-regulation code, but only there were 15 groups which had actually come together and brought the code. Later on, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has brought the recent intermediary guidelines. And specifically, I'd like to add here that these guidelines, or it says that this the streamed content should be judged on the basis of not being against the integrity and sovereignty of India, ensuring the security of the country, friend relations with foreign countries, and not showing anything or streaming any content which may disturb public order. So these are very vague kind of ideas that has been given in the code. So it doesn't give any much, it doesn't help as such regarding regulation as such. And specifically when I talked about objectification, it is a very intrinsic and a deep problem, and definitely doesn't find any place anywhere in the code, and we just forget about OTT platform. So it's not much of very help. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Siti. Yes, Ms. Keertana, you had raised your hand. Any observations or
Yes.
questions?
So I think
Yeah,
there's a
go ahead.
question that has been posted for me in the chat box. I would like to just quickly answer that, if that's all right with you.
Yes, Keertana, the question is, what are the legal issues for the virtual shareholding and how it is different from the traditional notion of shareholding?
All right. So thank you for that question. I think how I interpret this question is how virtual shareholder meetings are different from traditional notions of shareholder meetings. Is that correct, Mr. Kaushal? Because that is what I had actually addressed in my paper.
Yeah, I think you are going to the right direction, and I will really be thankful if you could address something
Sure.
Related to the corporate governance aspect related to the virtual shareholding.
All right. So I did highlight a couple of issues in the paper. Now, a couple of problems that are being faced in the Indian context, I would like to answer this question. Now, whenever invites for virtual shareholder meetings are sent, normally there could be a possibility that user IDs and passwords, they fall into wrong hands. So that may lead to misuse as well. So the whole system needs to be free from any possible manipulation. The registrars and the share transfer agents need to be provided with the correct data of shareholders. That is one problem that did arise in the past. Then problems related to connectivity. All of us are aware how the networks are not that good in all parts of the country. So connectivity remains an issue. It might lead to a situation which may lead to an interruption in participation. So that needs to be countered. Some shareholders may not be adept at handling digital interfaces. So we have shareholders belonging to all age groups, and some shareholders might not be very comfortable participating in a virtual shareholder meeting. So for that, I think the companies can come up with proper manuals. There could be some simulation exercise in order to make them more comfortable participating in such virtual shareholder meetings. So these are a couple of issues which we did face in the past 2 years. So in 2020 and 2021, we've had virtual shareholder meetings, but with time, of course, companies are adapting their infrastructure. Shareholders are also getting more comfortable with this entire this new era of virtual meetings, and this is the way to go. So these are a couple of issues that I did highlight in my paper along with a couple of solutions as well. So I hope that answers your question, sir.
Just a suggestion, Keertana. You have
Yes.
taken a good topic for the research with regard to the virtual shareholding. But one thing you need to take care that the technology has been introduced as far as the shareholding is concerned. So technology has been introduced in the past 2 and 3 decades itself. For example,
Correct.
if you see what we have the first, I would say the well technified stock exchange, that is the National Stock Exchange of India. So it has been established in 1992, and since the beginning, since the inception itself, it has relied upon the technology, and it has made a very fast technological progress in the decade of 90s itself. So maybe technology has come very late in the public domain, but as far as the government, defense, or stock exchanges are concerned, these are some niche area where the technology has technology, and specifically I would quote internet. It had made a good progress in the era of 1990s itself. So whenever you are going to take such kind of topic, so you have to be very, very careful to take something new. Okay, come with some new proposal, take something new, because a lot of research has already been done in such particular area. If you are planning to take this particular topic further in future, if you want to take it further, so what I would say that you can include some corporate governance questions related to the virtual shareholding. Whenever you are dealing with the shareholder, please keep in mind that the shareholders are the ownership. This particular element I did not find in your presentation. Please deal with also the ownership rights, that how the virtual shareholding is going to impact ownership right, how it is going to impact the ownership right, corporate governance per se. Then your research is going to be complete with all the aspects.
I do agree with you, sir. But what I actually wanted to focus more on was e-voting and virtual shareholder meetings, which we saw in the recent times. So I do understand that when we talk about electronic or virtual shareholding, it has been there for quite some time, and that is why I did not focus much on it, because a lot of research has already happened. But virtual shareholder meetings is something that we saw for the first time because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's just 2 years old, and I don't think a lot of research has happened in that domain, and that's why I actually wanted to focus more on that. But I do understand.
You can take into consideration how it is going to impact the corporate governance.
Correct. I can certainly do that, and I can perhaps start with this background that you have suggested, and I think that will just give the paper a more comprehensive sort of an outlook. So I do understand, and I do agree with you, sir. Thank you so much for your feedback. I will definitely include that. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much for your feedback, Dr. Ajit Kaushal. I'm sure the presenter has taken note of it. So one thing is clear from today's discussion is that indeed technology is a useful servant but a dangerous master. And we all need more and more specific rules and specific guidelines, specific laws and regulations to regulate the increasing arena of technological advancement. A big thank you to Dr. Madhumita Kothari and Dr. Gagandeep Kaur. Ma'am, we are truly grateful that you spared valuable time from your busy schedule, and I'm glad that we could conclude our session within the given time limit today. Thank you so much, all the presenters and all the participants. The participants in everybody in this session are requested to join for the valedictory session as well, since we'll be announcing the prizes for the best presenter and the best paper. And I would like to request Dr. Madhumita and Dr. Gagandeep to please submit your evaluation sheets after this session. Thank you so much.
I have submitted, Ramanpreet. First of all, you deserve a big thank you. You've moderated the session extremely well, and you've maintained the time very, very strictly. So that's wonderful and a great job done. And kudos to the entire team of GT Goenka who's organized such a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be part of this.
Thank you, Dr. Madhumita and Dr. Gagandeep. I would actually wanted to ask some question from Ravina. I could not ask, And now let me tell you that how we have organized. Actually, in the very beginning, we have got very good response, very encouraging response once we were out with the brochure, etc. So we got total 69 abstracts. Out of the 69 abstracts, since we had very strict parameters, so only 35 I suppose it is either it is 34 or 35 papers. Okay, they could pass through our test. So we have got all the quality papers. What the problem with the topic related to the trade? First, we kept the themes of this particular conference very, very broad, because technology has intervened in our all aspect of life. So what to leave? What to be left out? It was the question. Okay, so we have kept a very broad kind of themes. What the problem happened with regard to the topic of trade, that we received just 1 or 2 papers with regard to the trade. So it was the question before us, that where to put the papers related to the trade and WTO, etc. So ultimately we thought of to put the papers related to WTO and trade in this particular session, because this particular session is going to deal is dealing with the society, with these societal changes. So personally, I don't find any kind of disconnect. Trade and business is very much the part of our society. So I would congratulate all the presenters of this session. I would specifically congratulate Ravina, since her paper has passed through our test. So she has definitely written a very good paper, and we have brought her paper to this particular session. She is very young. She is the beginner. She is doing LLM, and of course, I expect that you have a very bright future, Ravina. Okay, just take it ahead. Okay. So again, I would congratulate Ravina and other participants also for their good papers, for their research work. You are coming forward to a very niche area of research. All of you are the new age researcher, I would say, because you are doing the research in the area which have been less addressed. So of course, whenever you are going to do the research, you are not going to find that much amount of paper as you could find in the when you are doing the research in the area of corporate law, and you are doing the research with regard to the constitutional rights or the human rights, etc. So here the researchers are definitely going to have a very hard time, and they have made a very good efforts. And now in this conference, I think the research related to law and technology has taken a good stride. So with these words, I would like to call upon our mentor of this conference, Dr. Azim B. Pathan. You can say a few words.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ajit. Thank you so much, Dr. Madhumita Madam and Dr. Gagandeep Kaur as well, for your benign presence for this one of the important technical sessions. And as Dr. Madhumita Madam has also suggested in the beginning, which I could see and listen in the beginning, that whatever outcome which we will be having based on this particular conference will be taking ahead the outcome of this conference by way of the book, in the book form, and in the souvenir form. And definitely this particular outcome we will be sending to the concerned ministry, sending to the concerned department as well, and a kind of value addition to the existing knowledge base. So indeed, that is the entire the process after this conference which we will be having. At the same time, I would like to express my gratitude, heartfelt gratitude for your valuable time which you have spent for judging, giving your input, your suggestions on the occasion of this particular international conference. We are so much thankful to you, Dr. Madhumita Madam. I am also thankful on behalf of entire G.D. Goenka University and School of Law, on behalf of our Managing Director, our Managing Director, our patron, Mr. Nipun Goenka, our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Tabrez Ahmed, and entire this organizing committee. We are so much thankful to you for your presence here, both of you, Dr. Madhumita and Dr. Gagandeep, and all participants as well.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gagandeep.